watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are yet again talking about Christian nationalism. And it's the third week. We're calling this Christian Nationalism Part 3, Dr. J on Christian nationalism. The last couple weeks, we interviewed people from different perspectives on the subject of Christian nationalism. 2 weeks ago, we had on Tim Stratton and Josh Klein, and they presented some reasons for thinking that Christian nationalism was a good thing, rather that there are some good aspects of it. They provided a distinction that separated themselves from other types of Christian nationalists. Then last week, I had the honor to interview Mike Austin. He is a professor of philosophy, and he's written on ethics, moral virtues. He's got a new book coming out against Christian nationalism, on why he thinks it's neither Christian, nor American. It's this foreign concept, really, to the United States and does not belong. People should not believe in it. So we had these different perspectives, and now I thought I'd like to offer some of my thoughts, reflect briefly on those interviews, what I thought on them. I do want to get into talking about the hot topic right now of Project 2025 and what that is. And then in the second half of the show, I'll be looking at another video from Dan McClellan. He's this fascinating progressive Mormon, and he looks at a response video on tricky passages from the Old Testament on OT violence, the difficult passages from the Old Testament. So I'll be reflecting on some of the things he has to say, so we'll be going through that video in the second half of the program today. So, okay, let's take a step back and think on the interviews on Christian nationalism. And if you haven't watched those, I want to encourage you to go to veracityhill.com. You can watch those interviews. They're embedded at posts at the website. You can also go to my YouTube channel where you can watch those interviews as well. I am no expert in Christian nationalism, so part of the reason for doing these interviews was a learning experience for me to hear from different perspectives. This is the sort of thing I like to do when I want to learn. I have put on conferences that present multiple perspectives on a single subject, and it's a way for me to learn more about the different views as well, because, look, we don't always have a bunch of time that we can invest into reading the books on the various perspectives of a single subject. Sometimes we need that material condensed down or synthesized. And so by having these little interviews that I've done, I was able to learn a little bit more, and I hope that you've been able to learn more as well. So, what do I think about Christian nationalism? Well, so one of the things I learned as I interviewed these two different perspectives, Tim Stratton and Josh Klein and Mike Austin, is that they both seem to agree that there's this other thing that really is like a true form of Christian nationalism. And that's something like Stephen Wolf's The Case for Christian Nationalism. That is this hardline position that is even against the way that the Constitution is written. There are self-identified Christian nationalists who want to change the Constitution. They want to change the model of the federal United States government, the national government. And they want to make it a more Christian-type government. So both Tim and Josh and Mike agree that that's not a good thing. Now, Josh called it something like a theocratic nationalism, and Tim separated himself from that sort of thinking and wanted to identify himself as an American nationalist. My interpretation or takeaway from that interview with those two guys is that they are highly patriotic individuals. They want to return back to the founding principles of the country. They do support the American government. I don't know that I would call them Christian nationalists. I mean, and even they separate themselves from that. So maybe there is this more middle ground approach where Mike would find himself in agreement with Tim and Josh on what would be considered sort of like a robust patriotism. So in that regard, I would say that there is this Christian nationalism, this hardline view, and there are concerns about it, there's this weaker, softer form of patriotism but I don't know that we could call that nationalism. In my interview with Mike last week, he sort of presented this more robust view of what nationalism looked like, a sort of interior imperialism. So it's an imperialism upon the nation. So there is this tricky line between deciding what are some good traits to a nation state and what are some bad traits to that nation state. And America itself has learned over the decades and the century plus of its existence, the 2 centuries of its existence, what it has done well and what it has done poorly. And it's improved upon that. There has been moral growth through the changing of our laws. And I do want to talk a little bit about what our country used to be like, because I think one of the things that I would sympathize with is the idea that America has been a more religious nation in the past. Now, sometimes this was good and sometimes this was bad. So let me explain. When I was in college, I read this great book by Stephen Waldman. Now, I don't agree with all of the conclusions of Waldman, but this book, Founding Faith, How Our Founding Fathers Forged a Radical New Approach to Religious Liberty, opened my eyes to the religious history of the United States, not just with regard to the demographics, but how religion played its role and relationship to the government. It's really important, and a lot of people miss this out in the contemporary political discussions today, to realize that the federal government, the First Amendment, was a prohibition against what the federal government could and could not do with regard to religion. It was going to be entirely neutral. Whereas the state governments could and did have formal religious denominations that they supported. There was a close tie of church and state at the state level. Sometimes this was more hardline, like Maryland, officially, right, Catholic state. You'd have other states that were officially a particular denomination, even a Protestant denomination. You would have other states like Pennsylvania, which was more diverse and more pluralistic. And they found a way of doing it well and allowing more religious liberty. Now, some problems, there were problems in a shift between the relationship between the federal government and the state government. And it all got started with the 14th Amendment, but in particular, how the 14th Amendment was interpreted by the Supreme Court. And Waldman goes into this, and he even describes how the authors of the 14th Amendment never could have imagined how their language and choice of words would have been later interpreted by the Supreme Court, such that now the Supreme Court and the federal government would oversee every nook and cranny of American life. Whether a public high school football coach could pray on a football field, whether there'd be prayer in school. These are the sorts of things, again, the First Amendment says, hey, the federal government's going to stay out of it. So how is it then that the judicial system is being used to dictate what happens at the local level? It's because of the imposition of the Bill of Rights upon the state governments. That's how. And that wasn't always the case. Now, I'm cranking through sort of this political history of what's called the selective incorporation doctrine. You can Google it, selective incorporation doctrine. But I think that this doctrine has led to an increase. I don't think this would be contentious to say it has led to an increase in federal oversight and how much role the federal government now plays in our local lives. I'm not making, when I say that, I don't say that with a good value judgment or a bad value judgment. Okay, that's just the fact. Now, the question is, how do we interpret that fact? I'm of the position that it has occurred, that judicial doctrine has occurred for the worse. I would prefer laboratories of democracy at the state level, because that was the way that the founders intended it with the 10th Amendment. I would prefer laboratories of democracy. So various states could take on state religions, etc. And it would be our duty, simply as citizens, to care for and to lobby other state governments for the position that we thought would work well, rather than a single dictate from the federal government deciding what state governments can and cannot do. So I'm a big states' rights guy. So I understand when people are frustrated at the movement our nation has gone on over the last century. When you look decade over decade over decade, we continue to see the decrease of the power and authority of state governments, such that we are becoming no longer the United States of America, but the United State of America. Ask yourself this question: what is the role of state governments? And if you think that the federal government should be solving all of the problems for all Americans, what role is there for having state boundaries? Why even have state governments anymore? Why? If the federal government should just solve everything, including the problems it creates, why should we have state governments? So, I like laboratories of democracy. I think you should too. And we should have the freedom to recognize, hey, some states are going to live differently. The way that Texans are going to live is going to be a lot different from the way that people in New Hampshire might live, or Vermont. Vermont, I think, has outlawed big box stores, right? So some of the big box stores like Costco that we might use for our groceries, Vermont's outlawed because they want to keep a slower pace of life. They want to support small businesses. They can decide how they want to live. Minimum wage law. The cost of living state to state varies based on property values and other factors. So the diversity of American life, I think, is beautiful, and we should continue to keep it diverse so people can create their own societies. Which is now fascinating because with Christian nationalism, people are concerned that there are Christian nationalists trying to create their own societies. I think if the Christian nationalists want to move to a state and create that their own little Christian haven, whatever that might mean, I think they should be welcome to do so. I think people who are libertarian-minded, who want to move to New Hampshire to create a libertarian-like state, should be free to do so. There's actually movements called the Free State Movement, and people are slowly but surely moving to New Hampshire in the hopes that they could somehow try to elect a libertarian to Congress or the Senate, and people should be free to do that. Now, I would disagree with the hardline Christian nationalists. I don't agree with libertarians on some issues, but people should be free to do what they want and move freely amongst the nation. I see we've got some people commenting already. Josh is watching. Thanks, Josh, Merrick, and Amber. Great to have you guys watching today's stream. So on Christian nationalism, what I'm seeing is a common guilt by association tactic in the public conversation. And I don't think that's healthy. It's certainly not accurate to depict our opponents unfairly. And we need to recognize what is Christian nationalism and what is not Christian nationalism. Because if you were, and Mike Austin brought this up last week, and it may have been brought up the week prior with Tim and Josh, if you believe that your rights and your freedom is grounded in your freedom is grounded in your rights given to you by the Creator God, well, you might be a Christian nationalist. Of course, that's insane, right? That's insane to actually think that, because Thomas Jefferson himself in the Declaration of Independence, which I have queued up here, how can we say he is a Christian nationalist when he wasn't even a Christian? I think many would say he was a deist. At best, you might say he was like a Unitarian Universalist. All right, here's the Declaration of Independence. This is from the National Archives site, okay? So this is clearly the official site for the U.S. government. Here's Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. All right, so this is the declaration. He says that rights come from the Creator God. But, boy, oh boy, if you were to read some articles critiquing Christian nationalism, see what they say here. Look at this. This is Politico, which is a reputable political magazine, newspaper, a newspaper. I'm not sure if they're still in print or if they're just digital now. Here's what they have to say. Here's the title: Trump allies prepare to infuse Christian nationalism in second administration. Let me be clear here at the outset, as we talk about this today. I am not endorsing any candidates. I am simply talking about the concepts, the claims, the critiques that are being thrown about in our public conversation, and I want to look at those things. So I'm not taking an official position here. I'm not saying you should vote one way or the other. I'm interested in a fair dialogue. And is this a fair dialogue? We want to pursue truth. So is it fair to accuse people of Christian nationalism if they say believe that rights come from the Creator God? Okay, here we go. Trump allies prepare to infuse Christian nationalism in second administration. And as I was reading this article, it goes on to describe some Christian nationalists here, or possibly alleged Christian nationalists. I'm not even sure if they would take on the term. And this is talking about a fellow named Vaught here. Vaught, who declined to comment, is advising Project 2025, that secret thing. It's not really secret. Everything's available on the web, but it sounds like this. The way it's being depicted is like it's this neo-Nazi or militia group that has issued this agenda. This is a 900-page advisory book by the Heritage Foundation, which is a highly respected Washington think tank. It's a conservative think tank. There's no hiding that. But the way it's being depicted, it's like this extreme right-wing agenda. And it's just mind-boggling. So here, Vaught, who declined to comment, is governing agenda that would usher in one of the most conservative executive branches in modern American history. The effort is made up of a constellation of conservative groups run by Trump allies who've constructed a detailed plan to dismantle or overhaul key agencies in a second term. Among other principles, the project's mandate for leadership, here we go, states that freedom is defined by God, not man. Are you kidding me? Oh no! Oh, we can't allow that to happen. Let me go back here. We can't allow that to happen, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Oh! I mean, this is just mind-boggling to me that there would be this attempt, this attack. Some people are trying to attack people for believing that rights come from God and that those people are Christian nationalists. This is a joke. And this is Politico. This is a well-known, it is left-leaning, but not, I don't think I'd describe it as progressive, a left-leaning news source. Now, one that is more progressive than Politico is Vox. Now, Vox has a wider spectrum of subjects, not only political analysis. But this one in particular also struck me as humorous. Trump may sound moderate on abortion. The group setting his agenda definitely aren't. So this one, too, had some commentary. Here, see, Heritage Foundation and other conservative think tanks. Here you go, Project 2025, a kind of super team of conservative think tanks and interest groups tasked with creating a playbook for the next conservative administration. So it goes on to describe Heritage Foundation. So it does this better than the Politico article. And it will separate Heritage from Christian nationalist groups, which is good. That's good. But still, it's this idea here of attacking these separate beliefs about religious liberty and this guilt by association, right? It's these groups combined. So it's guilt by association, that if you were to think this stuff, you might be a Christian nationalist. It's like a Jeff Foxworthy skit, right? I think he had a skit, you might be a redneck if you did certain things. And I would welcome followers of Veracity Hill. If you want to come up with a script like that, I'll consider bringing you on. We could record something, and we could say you might be a Christian nationalist. That could be a fun little skit. All right, let's see here. So here they're talking about the Christian nationalists. The U.S. is a Christian, so this is a third group influential for Trump on social issues is the Christian nationalist movement, whose adherents believe the U.S. is a Christian nation and that the country's laws should therefore be rooted in Christian values, according to NPR. Well, NPR is not a Christian nationalist group, so you're already looking at someone's interpretation of it. More than half of Republicans supported these views. The ideology counts amongst its adherents MTG. Sorry, Mark, I know you're a big fan of MTG, who has said, I am a Christian and I say proudly we should be Christian nationalists. I don't know why we give one hoot what MTG thinks, to be honest. She is not a public intellectual, we'll say. I think she is a popularist, so why we should use her as a representative remains to be seen. The idea that American laws should be rooted in Christianity isn't new on the right, but some observers are concerned about the extent to which Christian nationalists today prioritize their worldview over democracy. Good. Okay, so we are getting some good views here, some criticisms that are baked in here about what is exactly Christian nationalism. You see this even in Vox's segment, that there are different types of Christian nationalists. And that's sort of one thing that we've discovered here with these couple interviews with Tim and Josh and Mike, that there's this group. Yes, we can recognize sort of these features to it, but then there's this gray area, right? With Mike, we talked about, Granny and the American flag and where it belongs, if at all, in a church, right? Where is Granny? Is Granny a Christian nationalist? Well, probably not. Probably not. Rather, when people say things like they want to change the Constitution, they want to install a prince, right, a Messiah-type figure who's a Christian and who will make a formal religion, right, that's totally and wholly changing the way that the American government is structured. That's a bad sign. Another subject, well, let's see here. Before we get that, I've got one more article. I really had to pull this one up. I had never heard of PRISM, and I thought this was almost satire. I'm sorry. Lo and behold, it's not. The Christian Nationalist Playbook to Usurp Democracy. So here's this article by Karen. Is it Kieran? It might be Karen Darkwater. And this is a fascinating article at just how biased someone can be with this here. And I really had to look into this, and I'll share PRISM reports in the thread. Here we have Kieran Darkwater. I clicked on the bio because I wanted to learn more about, what this site was. And you just read the author's bio. They, them, trans-mask, non-binary, was the eldest daughter in a quiverful homeschooling Christian nationalist family. There's clearly stuff going on there, and those issues make their way into how this person interprets Christian nationalism. Just fascinating. Okay, one thing I wanted to talk about was the America First policy. What is the America First policy? Here's Wikipedia. You're welcome to look it up as well. It refers to this idea that, America first, even at the expense of other countries. America's always right. This populist policy, I think, exemplifies a distinctive feature to Christian nationalism, because nationalism is the idea of putting your country before others at the expense of others. Now, the way Tim and Josh understood that, it was when we say at the expense of others, it's because we're comparing America to other evil countries and America's doing the right thing. But it's possible that that's not the only way of interpreting it, that there could be an innocent and righteous nation. For example, let's look at George W. Bush and the war in Iraq. We were told weapons of mass destruction. We got to stop Saddam Hussein. It was all, at best, a mistake. Faulty intel, at best. And there's probably very good reason for thinking that wasn't even the case. But that's the most charitable way of interpreting it. America was wrong for invading Iraq. America was wrong. Now, an America First policy says America's never wrong. That whatever America does is best. And that, I think, is a dangerous doctrine. Because it basically says you think that your nation can never do wrong. And as Christians, we are called to be moral leaders in our society. So when the people we collectively elect to represent us in our republic do wrong, we have the obligation to say so. They are humans, just like we are, and they make mistakes. We should be willing to say when America has done something that is wrong. And this has occurred throughout the course of history. So going back to the early religious days of America, when states had official governments, official religions as part of their state governments and supported by taxpayers, there would be things that would be punishable, such as not going to church or not tithing. And you're like, well, wait a second. Why would that be the case? Well, that's because that's what the states decided. I think we have made moral progress when states have allowed for religious plurality. That would be a state I would live in. I enjoy the plurality. I enjoy conversations with people I disagree with. So I would choose a state to live in that allowed for religious plurality. So one concern over these Christian nationalists is that they wouldn't allow these things. They would go back. They have this romantic idea of the past. They would go back and make a state an official religion. They would make a religion an official state religion. Now, to do that, they have to get the Supreme Court, and you'd have to get the legislatures of Congress to pass laws that change the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, might clarify it. That's the way it can work with the checks and balances system. You don't need to change the Supreme Court. You just pass a law from the legislature. That's the Senate and the House. President signs the law. So that's the way you could get things done, like correcting a Supreme Court decision. Okay, so I think that America has made moral progress over the centuries. So we should look at this America First policy as an indicator. You know, if you're talking to someone who might sound like a Christian nationalist, ask them, hey, do you think America first? Do you think we should put America first before everybody else, even if we have done wrong? Even if we have done wrong, then that's sort of another way you can identify if someone were a Christian nationalist. Okay, so finally, I want to talk about Project 2025. So we brought it up. It's already appeared in some of these articles I've shared here from Politico and Vox. Project 2025 is put out by the Heritage Foundation. They call it the Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. And it is a collection of essays, position papers on what a conservative form of government might look like. It is 922 pages. You can go to project2025.org, check it out. You can download the free PDF. Mark here at Defenders jokes that he would, print it out for me. But you can see here the contents. So different sections regarding the different departments in the federal government, under the executive branch, what these departments should look like, policy positions. You can see it's sort of an extensive approach. What I have seen online for what the 2025 project would lead to is a fascinating social experiment, because I have seen so many straw men attacked at this document about what it says, and it doesn't say it at all, not even close. So let's look at this list put out by Project 2025, Myths versus Facts. Does it end no-fault divorce? They say divorce is not mentioned in our policy handbook. If we wanted to be technical, I think there is one adjectival use of divorce. Let's see here. National security policy must include the prioritized allocation of resources. When policies are divorced from the resources required to implement... Yes, it's not talking about it's not talking about marriage and divorce and marriage. Nowhere you see, I just did a search function. So you can search this big, huge document yourself looking for these words. How can you say it says no, it'll lead to the end of no-fault divorce? Now look, I actually support the end of no-fault divorce. I think we should get rid of it at the state level. The federal government shouldn't be involved with that, but I think at the state level it should be ended. But this document itself doesn't say anything about it. Complete ban on all abortions without exceptions, false. You can see here, ban contraceptives, false. The mandate says nothing about banning or restricting contraception. So you'll see a lot of these accusations thrown out in this partisan political warfare, and it doesn't create a fair dialogue. If we want to have a fair dialogue, we want to understand the other side. So let's understand the other side. And we want to understand the other side fairly and accurately and charitably. But you frequently don't get that with partisan tactics. And that goes both ways, sadly. So that's why we should be an equal opportunity offender and an equal opportunity defender. So Project 2025 is getting a bad rap. It would not lead to a Christian nationalist state. In fact, if we were to search the document, nothing about nationalism. The term nationalism does not appear there. The word Christian appears 7 times. It updated. They will soon turn to Christian schools and clubs. Okay, so nothing about the federal government becoming Christian. Let's look at the 6 other uses here. The U.S. cannot neglect a concern for human rights and minority rights, which must be balanced. Let's zoom in here. Special attention must be paid to challenges of religious freedom. Religious freedom, especially the status of Middle Eastern Christians and other religious minorities. So this is a plea for the federal government in its foreign affairs. This is the Department of State. In the foreign affairs, to have a care for Christians and other religious minorities. Well, if you're a Christian nationalist state, why would you care about other religious minorities? You wouldn't if you are a Christian nationalist state. Okay, let's move along. Talks about, this is about COVID, the CDC. How much risk mitigation is worth the price of shutting down churches on the holiest day of the Christian calendar and far beyond, as happened in 2020? Okay, so you want to honor people's houses of worship. That doesn't have to be exclusively Christian. One critique against the Department of Justice is that the Department of Justice was attacking a Christian web designer. The lawyers for the federal government wanted to require a Christian web designer to make a custom website supporting LGBTQ values. So this was the federal government. Remember what the First Amendment says about remaining neutral on these subjects? But now you have the DOJ not remaining neutral. So it's going against the meaning and the value of the First Amendment. So that's a problem. But this is not Christian nationalism. They're not advocating. They're basically saying the DOJ should stay neutral, not that the DOJ should institute a formal Christian religion. All right. The 5th use of Christian appears in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay, that's the tradition and heritage Western civilization has inherited. Nothing about making the American government a nationalist state. Sabbath rest, talking about a day off of work. And I like this line here. A shared day off makes it possible for families and communities to enjoy time off together. Unfortunately, that communal day of rest has eroded under the pressure of consumerism and secularism. So what's their suggestion? Congress should encourage communal rest. Not require, encourage. Big difference when a federal government encourages people to do something, just like how the CDC might encourage people to do something. That's different from coercion. The last and final use of the term Christian, also under the Department of Labor, we have here, in addition, religious organizations. Not exclusively Christian. Religious organizations should be encouraged to participate in apprenticeship programs. America has a long history of religious organizations working to advance the dignity of workers and provide them with greater opportunity. From the many prominent Christian and Jewish voices in the early labor movement to the labor priests who would appear on picket lines to support their flocks. So of all the 7 uses of the word Christian in this 922-page document, none of them have anything to do with Christian nationalism. So if you encounter any web article that you see that associates Project 2025 with Christian nationalism, call the bluff. Say, where in the document does it support this term? Where does it even support this concept? It's not there. So from what I've learned of what Christian nationalism is, from my 2 interviews with Tim and Josh and Mike Austin explicitly against it, this document has nothing to do with Christian nationalism. It's a position piece from a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. I read something like 110 volunteers, so people didn't even get paid to submit their contributions for their position papers on this. It was volunteer-based. And that's all it is. But here, the media wants to make it appear like it's this agenda from a neo-Nazi group or this militia group, this extreme fringe sect that Trump is affiliated with somehow. Come on, folks, let's have a fair dialogue about political philosophy in our country instead of this partisan warfare. Unfortunately, that happens all the time, and like I said, it happens from both sides. So, one thing I've learned from the 2 interviews over the last couple weeks, again, like I said earlier, there was this agreement, it seems, that there is this hardcore view of Christian nationalism, which is purposed to even change the national government and to make it a formal Christian government that is against the values of the historic American government and the American culture as well. The system of federalism, that is, you have a national government and you have state governments. I want to continue supporting the existence of state governments as laboratories of democracy, and I want my federal government to be so small to allow the states to explore what they should do. When the national government gets involved, that decreases a sense of obligation by the state governments because they think the federal government's just going to solve these things. When in fact, when we look at our economic woes, it's frequently, not always, but frequently the result of federal interference in the marketplace. So it's the federal government that caused the problem and now wants to solve the problem. For example, within the Department of Education, the student debt crisis, quote-unquote crisis. This student debt crisis is the result of the federal government giving out student loans. They didn't have to do that. They wanted to, and now they're trying to solve the problem. People didn't have to go to the federal government for the loan. They could have gone to some other bank to get the loan, but the federal government made it juicy and enticing. So it created this problem, and it's trying to solve this problem. I don't think it should work like that. I think it's better to leave these issues to the states. So that way, if the federal government screws up big time, not everybody is responsible for it. If a state government were to screw up, well, they've got to own that. But then other state governments could learn from those mistakes and try to improve on, some might say, a more efficient form of government, or just not doing something like that in terms of how it interferes or offers a welfare benefit. Okay, those are kind of my thoughts on Christian nationalism. Again, I think it's clear that there's this extreme form, and I would not be supportive of that. I think we should be patriotic. I think there are a lot of good values to the American system. I think those values are certainly compatible with a reading of the scriptures, so we can recognize the good values there. We can pursue justice and what does a just society look like, I think America is ahead of some other countries in this regard. When let's take racism as an example. As much as the media wants to make you believe that America is this highly racist nation, go travel. Go travel to other countries, and you'll see what racism looks like. There are plenty of other countries that continue to be hardcore racist, and America is well ahead of those nations in terms of how we treat all humans with respect and dignity. All humans have rights from their Creator God. That is a distinctive belief that does place the American government ahead of other nations, and in some respects, far ahead of other nations. So, don't always believe what you read in the media. Do your research. Sometimes take a break maybe from the media, or what's that phrase? Go touch grass. Go touch grass. That might give you a little breather from the tensions that you might see online. All right. I've been talking enough about Christian nationalism. If you want to learn more about the history of religious belief and its relationship to state governments, I highly recommend Founding Faith by Stephen Waldman. It's been out for quite some time now. I read it some 15, 18 years ago. And great little resource, easy read, very accessible, not super academic. It's 200 pages. And so if you like American history, you'll definitely like the book. Goes into some of the founders and explores the different state governments. I don't agree with all the conclusions of Waldman, but for me it was a very educational book, and I learned quite a bit, so I highly recommend that. All right, when we come back, I'm going to be looking at a video from Dan McClellan on Old Testament passages, the tricky nature of some verses in the Old Testament. Sort of been a theme here in our second half segments looking at Old Testament passages. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill with Dr. Kurt Jarris.
Hi, I'm YouTube.
And I'm Apologetics 315.
Oh, that's nice. What do you do again?
I'm a video hosting platform for Christian apologists.
Oh, you're Christians who apologize for being offensive.
No, that's not what that means.
Oh, I don't like your tone.
My tone?
Oh, I'm sorry. 1 sec. Sorry. There. That'll help you not sound so offensive.
Apologetics315.com, your home for Christian apologetics videos and community.
No one told us we could actually stand on stools. So unfair.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
You're listening to Veracity Hill with Dr. Kurt Jarris.
All right, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. And I want to thank our sponsors for supporting our podcast here, our live stream. If you wanted to support our work here at Veracity Hill, you can go to veracityhill.com/donate and become a monthly partner with us. It helps to support and sustain our ministry efforts here at Veracity Hill, from the various week-to-week live streams to other forms of content, long-form content, and writing projects that I have underway and active. And I would be honored to receive your support for this ministry work. So if you like this material, consider becoming a monthly partner with us today, and we would send you a hat and a mug from Veracity Hill if you become one of our monthly partners. You can learn more about that by going to our website, veracityhill.com. All right, well, the last couple weeks we've looked at tricky passages from the Old Testament. A couple weeks ago, I looked at Randall Rouser and moral incrementalism. Then last week, we brought on none other than Dante Stack to talk mano a mano about 1 Samuel 15, if I'm remembering correctly. Let's see here. Is that right? I'd have to go back and check. Looking at David and the prophet Nathan and how we should best interpret polygamy and monogamy. Well, now, today, I want to revisit a little bit of the concepts discussed with Rouser, but I want to look at a video by Dan McClellan. He's this fascinating progressive Mormon. He's been building a following on YouTube, and I think he's primarily on TikTok, and these videos get re-uploaded to YouTube. And he's a really fascinating guy because he holds to a progressive view. He holds to critical theory in how it's to be applied to hermeneutics and interpretation. But he identifies as a Mormon. So that's really fascinating stuff. And he's an Old Testament scholar, so no doubt about that. So he's got the creds. But some of his interpretations, I think, are suspect on how we should interpret the Old Testament. This video in particular, responding to apologetics about God's violence. Dan is not a fan of apologetics. And I think one of his taglines is something like data over dogma. Unfortunately for Dan, he is an apologist, whether he likes to be or not. It's what he does. He defends beliefs, positions, and so in that regard, he's an apologist. Now, this one, we're going to go super deep, so you got to follow along with me. We're going to go deep. This will be 4 layers deep. There's a guy who made a video, and this other fellow, Josh Benson, I think his name, does this response video to these Bible verses. And Dan's going to critique Josh on how to interpret these passages. Now, sometimes Dan's criticisms of Josh are warranted. Other times they are not. So I, Dr. J, am going to look at Dan's critiques of Josh's comments of this other guy. I don't really like going this many layers deep, but I feel like we're going to knock out a lot of Bible passages here from this 10-minute video that Dan has made. So bear with me as we look at each verse, and we'll try to view these in blocks, and we'll deal with each one as they come. So here we go.
Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. The fit for this video is black and white version of Jim Lee's X-Men number 11.
All right, Dan, I have a question for you. How many t-shirts do you have? Because it's like every video, there's a new t-shirt. I really want to know how many t-shirts are in your wardrobe. And do you get people donating these shirts? How can I get t-shirts that I can showcase on my videos? That's my first question for you, Dan.
Let's take a look at a video.
I decided to let the Lord speak to me as I read through the Bible. I started to get really disturbed by some of the things that I was noticing.
So Bob here is having trouble with some of the crazier
So Bob is that guy, and this is Josh. Here we go.
verses in the Old Testament, and even more so reconciling how a good and just God could be involved with such crazy things. So I'm going to make a video here responding to the verses that he has.
All right, let's see it.
That's his
That's
catchphrase.
1 Samuel 15:3.
Here we see God commanding the Israelites to destroy Amalek. Now, it's important to remember when we see God killing people in the Old Testament, there's usually a reason behind it.
So this is pretty standard apologetic fare for genocide, and it is utterly pathetic. It is an attempt to make it okay for Israel to go kill every last man, woman, child, suckling infant, and fetus in the womb. And the reasons are fabricated. None of this is in the text at all. At most, the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 14:48 are represented as plunderers. Israel is far worse. But we actually have an explicit reason given in 1 Samuel 15:2 for why Israel is to go engage in cherem, or ritual, slaughter, sacrifice, genocide. And what's that reason? God remembers that centuries before their ancestors fought against Israel when they were coming up out of Egypt. That's why they tell the Kenites, hey, get out of here. We're not after you. Because they were kind to Israel when Israel was coming up out of Egypt. These are people who had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with what they claim their ancestors did centuries before. But even the story of the genocide of the Amalekites is just propaganda. It's a way to set up Saul so that he can be represented as not obeying Adonai in all things, so that he can be dismissed, the kingdom can be taken from him and given to David, who, by the way, later on goes and kills all living things among the Amalekites, not because God told him to, not because they were being violent, but because he didn't want to leave any survivors or witnesses who could go report that he was betraying the Philistines. So there's no excuse for this genocide, and this attempt to excuse it is absolutely pathetic.
Okay. Wow, do I have some thoughts on Dan's take on this? You can see he's passionate. He refers to this sort of defense, this apologetic, as pathetic. Well, Dan's got a serious problem in his hermeneutic here, because on the one hand, he wants to critique Josh Benson. That's this fellow right here, okay? He wants to critique Josh Benson as defending genocide. But here's the problem. Dan himself recognizes that the OT passages are propaganda. He calls them propaganda. So the shrewd interpreter of the Bible will recognize that these are exaggeratory or even embellished claims of military victories. So let's look at 1 Samuel 15. That's why I was thinking the passage was with Dante was 1 Samuel 15, because that was up here on cue today. So here's the verse in question. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Now the question is this an exhaustive, detailed command from Yahweh, or is it exaggerated language? We can see here that what takes place is a military battle. They allow the Kenites to depart. And then you have here, as Bible Gateway wants to log in, look at verse 8. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive and devoted to destruction all the people at the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, of the oxen, fat and cans. Right? He would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. You see here that this is, as Dan admits, propaganda. Why? Well, they say it's to depict Saul in a certain way. So, did Yahweh actually command Saul to go do all of these things? Or when Yahweh commanded it, was it exaggerated military language? Because there's two ways of interpreting this passage. You can think that the command was literal and exhaustive, or that it was simply a command to go to battle. And those are two different things. Because the Kenites departed, so that's already an exception. So exceptions are allowed. So we can see it's already non-literal. Now this concept, this theme, we see especially with the conquest account in the book of Joshua. And we see the same type of language. And guess what? When you read Joshua closely, you can see that there were military battles that were won, but that there were still people. Why in the book of Judges are there problems all over the place? Because they did not kill everybody, even though they said they killed everybody. Right? So all doesn't always mean all. All can be a general all, not a meticulous, exhaustive all. So Dan says it's pathetic to interpret this as genocide. But what if we don't interpret it as genocide? What if haram is to push out the people from the land, and that it doesn't require or necessitate a meticulous killing even of the child and infant, meticulously speaking? So it seems like Dan wants to have his cake and eat it too. So I don't think that's fair to say it's a pathetic defense. So I think Dan should help Josh out a little better here with what the text actually means and how we should understand it in light of the hints and clues in the text itself, so we can better understand what transpired back then. So I don't think we should hold it against Yahweh that Yahweh commanded genocide. But if you want to learn more, you can click the link for the Vimeo On Demand page. I put on a conference back in 2018 called Genocide in Scripture, where I presented 4 different views. I invited 4 different speakers, scholars, Old Testament scholars, and authors to come and present their different views. And so you can check out the different views there at the Vimeo On Demand page. And again, if you're wondering, hey, how do I deal with this tricky passage? That's one way you can consider a multi-view perspective on that subject. All right, let's keep chugging along. And we're probably only going to get through half of this video right now, but that's all right.
And this attempt to excuse it is absolutely pathetic.
Numbers 5:11 through
Okay, let's deal with Numbers 5:11 through 21.
21 talks about how if you suspect your woman of adultery, you should use this recipe to induce abortion.
We have to remember this was a time when women were brutally killed, even if they were suspected of cheating on their husband. So God creates this ritual to essentially save the lives of not only innocent women, but also women that were guilty for cheating on their husbands. Also, the word miscarry is only found in the NIV translation, not anywhere else, and it's refuted by many scholars that this ritual had anything to do with an abortion or a baby.
So this is the sotah, the ordeal of bitter waters, and I would have 2 things to say in response. The first is that I actually agree with this creator that I don't think a fetus or a pregnancy is in view here. I think the favorable outcome of the sotah is that the woman is blessed with fertility. That's why it says she will conceive. There's not a pregnancy in view when she goes through the ordeal. The unfavorable outcome, I would argue, is that she will be cursed with infertility. The imagery that is used to describe the curse is associated in broader ancient Southwest Asian literature with infertility. The other thing to say is that there are absolutely no data whatsoever that suggests this is a protective ritual, that this has anything to do with preventing men from just indiscriminately killing women they suspect of adultery. That is just making up a reason that this ritual is okay. But it's not. It robs women of their agency. It allows men to impose their will upon them because of their own insecurities and their own suspicions.
Okay. So Dan had some good things to say there, but then he goes on to say, and I think we just need to nuance this more carefully. It robs them of their agency. Dan, as an OT scholar, knows the rights of women, or lack thereof, in the Old Testament. This was a different world. It was a foreign world. And as a moral incrementalist, maybe you have seen this over the last couple weeks, I want to understand the ancient culture of the Israelites, like we might try to seek to understand another ancient culture. And we shouldn't be so shocked and surprised that these ancient and foreign cultures acted way different than us 21st century Americans. And yet, some of these scholars, like Rouser and McClellan, are just so passionate about justice, and rightfully so. That's a good trait and virtue. But it's like they don't understand how far removed we are. And so, as a moral incrementalist, and I said this before with Rouser, I'll say it again with Dan, he is standing on the shoulders of giants. He is, in some ways, sawing off the branch or the trunk that he sits on, right? The tree branch from the trunk he sits on. You don't get to today's values without the Judeo-Christian tradition. You don't get to today's Western civilization values of human rights without it. And if you want a book on that, let's see if I've got it within reach. I do. Tom Holland's Dominion. It's a thick book. Here it is. A great book that basically argues we swim in Christian waters. So Dan's critique of the Old Testament lack of agency of women is just totally misguided. It's a category error. You have to place yourself in that world at that time and understand that society in place and evaluate it upon those terms and conditions. It was a wholly different world than today. Wholly different. So I think we should show a little bit more charity when we seek to understand these ancient people groups, rather than belittling and lambasting this ancient culture for the lack of what we think that they should have done. We are not on moral high ground in this respect. Yes, we've made moral improvement and moral progress, but I don't know that we would have created a much better society ourselves if we were in those circumstances. So I'll leave it at that. And I don't just mean that exclusively with regard to women's rights, but the broader issues and other subjects as well that the ancient Israelites had to deal with. Sometimes we just don't understand, so we kind of laugh. We just laugh at those laws, but we don't understand why they had that and why they decided to do it. These laws weren't made in a vacuum. There were very serious issues that they had to find plausible ways to move forward and to pursue justice. Okay, let's take one more clip here from Dan McClellan.
Numbers 31:17.
So it's important to remember that in this conflict, the Midianite women were not innocent. They were actively prostituting themselves to Israelite men to convince them to abandon the cause, abandon God, or else.
So this is pure and utter fabrication. There's no text anywhere that suggests any, much less all, Midianite women who were not virgins were engaged in some act of sex work and seduction and things like that. The only thing we have is Numbers 25, where an Israelite man brings a Midianite woman into his family, marries her. So it's intermarriage with the Midianites that is represented as the issue. And then Phinehas kills them both, a ritual sacrifice that purges the camp of the sin. And so this is just making excuses for what really is going on with killing all of the men and all of the women who were not virgins and keeping alive the women who were virgins. That's about sex slavery, and that's pretty explicit in the text, but that's unacceptable for apologists.
Hosea 13.
I don't know that that's unacceptable to apologists. Some apologists are open to that understanding and interpretation. I think we can recognize the Old Testament text as this ancient world, and it's a world wholly different from ours. And it also describes a historical events. Description is different from prescription, so that's important to keep in mind when we want to properly understand the Old Testament. It's not always prescribed that Yahweh thinks we today should think these things. Again, this is an advantage to the moral incrementalist, that God works with people and societies where they are at for the purposes of moral growth and progress. So we would understand that the people groups before us would not be in a place where we are today. All right, let's keep going. That one was fast. We'll keep rolling here.
16.
Hosea is a prophetic book, meaning it's not totally literal, rather it's predicting the future. And the actual verse says, their infants shall be dashed to pieces. So it's not God saying that he's going to do something to people, rather there is someone prophesying that there will be a horrible conflict between two groups of people.
Nope, this is flatly misreading this verse, which begins by saying Samaria will bear her guilt for rebelling against God. And the fact that this is God's punishment is reflected also in verse 14, where we have these rhetorical questions where the answer is no, God will not restrain Sheol and death. And the verse ends by saying God will not be compassionate.
Yes, Dan is right there. If we look up here, Hosea 13, here's the passage in question. Samaria shall bear her guilt because she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. Their little ones shall be dashed in pieces and their pregnant women ripped open. Now, I think Josh, so Dan's correct. Josh is misreading the text here. But there's another way of taking this and interpreting this. Prophetic literature sometimes has exaggeratory language. Sometimes that occurs in prophetic literature. So I think we might be able to point to this and recognize that ancient warfare, this is a way of saying that a nation reaps what it sows, warfare will come to them. And this is how Yahweh worked with corporate nations, not just Israel, but was overseeing and sovereign over the other nations as well. So I don't know that we have to think of this as a meticulous prophecy of what would transpire, but a simple general principle that war will come, punishment will come through warfare upon Samaria. All right, let's take one more here, and then we'll close up for today. This is Psalm 137:9.
Psalm 137:9.
Psalms is a poetic book, meaning it's just songs and poems. And the regular human, not God, the regular human singing here, they're saying, I've seen the horrible things that have happened to the little ones of Jerusalem. And they're just basically saying, like, I hope that Babylonians get what's coming to them. That's it.
So the argument is that this passage is not inspired by God. I'm going to need a list of all the passages in the Bible that are not inspired by God.
Leviticus 29.
Come on. I think that's a cheap shot by Dan. That's not what Josh is saying. He didn't say that it's inspired. That was short. Let's review this. He's not saying that Psalms are not inspired. He's saying that Psalms are a reflection of human emotion through poetry. All right, listen to this again.
37:9.
Psalms is a poetic book, meaning it's just songs and poems. And the regular human, not God, the regular human singing here, they're saying...
So when he says not God, Josh is saying here, it's a reflection of human emotion. We can still think the text is divinely inspired, but that it's not Yahweh explicitly speaking through the prophet or speaking directly to, say, Moses, for example. This is the human. It's a reflection of human emotion.
I've seen the horrible things that have happened to the little ones of Jerusalem, and they're just basically saying, like, I hope that Babylonians get what's coming to them. That's it.
So the argument is that this passage...
So again, it's not about divine inspiration, although it's kind of funny that Dan said he wanted a list. For more subjects like the Psalms, this category of Psalms are called the imprecatory Psalms. When an individual wishes harm upon one's enemies and wants God to punish one's enemies. Now, imprecatory psalms, again, are descriptive of the human emotions. They're not prescriptive even. I don't think that it's required of humans to believe the same thing that the psalmist states in that emotional state that they are in. That's not required of us. So I would say that, yes, there are some passages of Scripture which are divinely inspired, which describe a range of human emotions. But we don't have to consent to holding that same belief, even though the text is divinely inspired. So that's how I'd respond to the imprecatory psalms, whether it's that one in particular or another one. Description is not prescription. Okay, I've already gone over for today, so we'll leave it there for now. That's responding to apologetics about God's violence. Dan McClellan's response video. Again, we were going 4 degrees there deep, quite a bit, but I'm not persuaded by Dan's takes here. Sometimes he is right to critique Josh Benson. Other times, I think he's missed the mark a few times. And so I would look forward to Dan's response here to the things I'm saying. He is an Old Testament scholar. I'm a theologian, but that doesn't mean that theologians and Old Testament scholars can't talk to each other. So I'd welcome his response on that. And perhaps next week we might consider looking further at the rest of this video. All right, well, I want to thank those who tuned in for today's program. Thanks for watching. I saw we've got some comments. Amber, thanks for being active there in the chat, and I'll be sure to review those comments afterward today. Thank you for those who have tuned in. I want to thank our technical producer, Gabe, and also can't forget Mark at Defenders Media for the communications work he does. And some graphic design work, too, now. He's been doing some of the thumbnail images for Veracity Hill. So thank you to the little team there. And I hope that you have learned something here a little as I've thought through more about Christian nationalism. And we've looked at then Dan McClellan's video here. Next week, I'll be starting a new series on the Gallic monks. These were 5th century monks that I studied as part of my doctoral dissertation. And we'll be doing a 4-part series on that. Next week will be an introduction to the subject matter, sort of the historical introduction, but also the theological introduction as well, and why I got interested in studying the subject matter. And then over the following 3 weeks, we'll look at John Cassian, Vincent of Lorenz, and Faustus of Ries. And then I'll be off for a couple weeks in August, but I wanted to look at the Gallic monks. It's a favorite subject of mine. But if you're interested in the Calvinism-Arminianism debate, you'll definitely want to watch this 4-part series as we look at a third way at critiquing the false dichotomy here. And so if you're interested in those discussions of sin, salvation, and human nature, I definitely invite you to tune in and ask me some questions as well. So, all right, we've got to sign off here. Again, I want to thank everybody for watching. Thank you to the sponsors and patrons, folks that chip in a few bucks each month to help us. And I hope that you'll join me next week as we look at the Gallic monks, that historical and theological introduction. So thank you for joining me today as we were striving for truth on Christian nationalism.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.